Welcome to audio highlights for Chapter 6, Sexual Orientation and Heterosexism. This chapter opens up talking about some, actually multiple definitions that we'll need to connect, especially since we just in Chapter 5 explored gender and gender identity. Now we'll look a little bit deeper in terms of concepts like social sex role identity, which is the gender roles that we play, adopt, or adhere to based on our cultural norms, kind of what we exhibit in society. And we'll also look at sexual orientation identity. So, this too is different than gender identity. It involves a person's sexual and emotional attraction to members of either the opposite or of the same sex. So, this chapter is going to focus on sexual orientation. And we know that it's not simply an issue of assigning a label. The sexual orientation actually describes a set of about seven variables. These include sexual behaviors, emotions, sexual fantasies, sexual attraction, social preference, heterosexual, bisexual, or homosexual lifestyle, and self identification. So these are actually defined by Klein in 1990, and these have been a way for individuals to recognize that sexual orientation is much more than just a label or a term or one's identity. So, but speaking of labels and terms, our chapter does a great job too of recognizing that language, particularly with this group of oppressed individuals, is very meaningful, and it's important for you as a professional to use the right terminology. And this can make people very nervous. I know I don't want to say the wrong thing people might be concerned about. And the best way to go about that is to ask a client or ask a person that you're working with as a professional, what do you prefer? There's a great Voices from the Field pullout in our text on page 128. It's Voices from the Field 6-1, where an individual describes why it was bothersome to them when a counselor would use the term homosexual. So this individual preferred gay or lesbian. So I think that's a helpful perspective to read, and it really just underlines the importance of asking the individual, what is it that you prefer when we talk about these things? Because the very worst thing that you can do is avoid talking about issues related to multiculturalism just because you don't want to be offensive or you don't want to say the wrong thing. It's much better to, from the very start, say, I'm not quite sure what word is the best or what word you prefer. And ask the person what they prefer, especially if they're the minority member, and then go from there in terms of following their lead and what terms are appropriate. So the next part of this chapter talks about gay identity and lesbian identity development. It compares a number of different theorists who came up with different stages that individuals might go through as they identify as gay or lesbian, and then what these different stages mean to that person. And so these, again, a table may be a helpful way for you to kind of keep these straight in terms of which theorists propose which and how the stages do and do not align. There are also a couple of identity development models proposed for bisexual individuals, and these you'll see have some similarities and some differences from our gay and lesbian identity development models. It's also important that we understand a few different terms of specific types of oppression. So we have heterosexism, which is actually the oppression of LGBTQI. And just as a quick reminder, that's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, and intersex. So it's a few more letters than you may have previously heard. Internalized heterosexism is actually when we internalize that idea that a heterosexual orientation is preferred. So this someone who was experiencing kind of self-hate and self-devaluation or low self-esteem related to being gay or lesbian may be experiencing internalized heterosexism. And then a related but a very different term is homophobia, which is actually the fear or the hatred of LGBTQI people. And again, that internalized hatred or negative attitudes would be actually experienced by somebody who did identify as LGBTQI, but they actually had negative feelings or attitudes of hate towards people of their same sexual orientation. So you can see how these concepts overlap, but it is important to understand their differences as well. We also want to describe heterosexual privilege. So, what are the unearned advantages in our society that you get basically just by having a heterosexual orientation or identifying as that? And if you'll recall back to our backpack of privilege that we talked about before, kind of what would be in that backpack if you identify as heterosexual? And so the answer to that would be things like a fairly easy and straightforward process to marry in any state you'd like, access to medical information about your loved one in the event of emergency. You have legal and financial rights to inherit property if your loved one or spouse passes away. In many areas, you can't adopt if you are a gay or lesbian couple. So you also have maybe less obvious privileges like validation by the media and the culture. When you turn on the TV to watch a sitcom, odds are the relationships that you see are going to be heterosexual. So that is another unearned advantage or privilege that individuals may not have the opportunity to experience if they identify as LGBTQI. Our chapter also reflects back on that historical resistance to heterosexism and trying to normalize the experience that LGBTQIs have been oppressed over time. So there's that historical flashback as we've had in previous chapters, and then we also look at current attitudes, which we still have many barriers in place in terms of marriage rights as well as employment discrimination rates, that these are battles that are currently being fought in our court system. So this this chapter is unique in that it still has kind of some present day ramifications in terms of legal precedent and those types of things that are still being discussed and resolved. So as we move through, we'll notice some differences in relationship status and family issues. We know that there was a really interesting study done a few years ago related to lesbian and gay parents, and it actually sparked a movie. That the movie's called "The Kids Are Okay" or "The Kids Are All Right." And the findings of the study were that lesbian and gay parents were at least equal to heterosexual parents in terms of their children's mental health, their own parenting skills, and the quality of those family relationships. What they actually found is that in some cases, these kids were better adjusted. So that was a fascinating finding in that it once again emphasized for advocates and for LGBTQI parents or people that would like to be parents that this doesn't preclude positive parenting. One's sexual orientation does not preclude that. So we also in this chapter look again at the numerous consequences of heterosexism. We have mental health consequences, we have physical consequences, and we have social consequences. So once again, we kind of use that template to study so that you understand all sides of this aspect. And then again, we end on what can you do as a counselor or as a human services professional to address heterosexism. And so we can go from the very specific of exactly how you treat and work with your client in terms of being collaborative and exploring how heterosexism permeates their life, or we can go much more broad and really work in terms of speaking to schools, giving demonstrations about, and even being involved in social justice movements in terms of advocacy to change laws. So there are many opportunities, again, to kind of appropriately address heterosexism in a counseling relationship, and those will be determined by you as a professional, which you feel like are most appropriate.